Right, this discussion is going to be on the Enclosure Acts and the Black Acts of the essentially the 18th and into the 19th centuries. The Enclosure Acts, this is parliamentary acts. This is a very big change from what we've been discussing earlier, where we looked at the 15th, 16th, and even the 17th centuries, where we had enclosures, especially early on in the 15th and again in the 17th centuries, but they're mostly local, right? Local landowners, often against great opposition, enclosing their lands, trying to use the legal process, or just going ahead and kicking people out of their leases and building hedges. It's been a very local, very sort of sporadic on and off process. But what we're getting here in the 18th century, with the increased domination in Parliament of both the landowning interests, the farming classes, and the gentry, and as well as the more mercantile classes from the cities, is Parliament is going to pass acts which are actually going to enclose lands, and it's just there enclosed. So a top-down significant process, and in fact, between the late 17th and into the mid-19th century, approximately 6 million acres of previously sort of common lands or open field lands will be enclosed. And to enclose, and in the case of open fields, to engross, right, consolidate, are now enacted by law, not by local activity. Okay. At first, beginning in the late 17th century, going through the 18th century, these would be private acts of Parliament. A private act of Parliament is a specific act that affects only one locality or group or entity. Okay, so someone will pass an act of Parliament, they'll bring it through, say, the Member of Parliament for Bolton in Yorkshire, will bring an act through and say that this particular area around Bolton, we're going to enclose. Okay, and that would then go through Parliament and be passed. It's very specific. Over this century, there'll be hundreds of these private acts. We're enclosing this, now we're enclosing that, here's another act to enclose that. And this ball gets rolling in the Parliament, being the landowners and the mercantile classes are quite happy to sort of enforce this process from above. Like I said, it's a big change, because what I think we had seen earlier centuries is there was the push for enclosure, but often at parliamentary level and other government levels, there was often opposition to it. There's often be commissions and acts to sort of undo the enclosure and so forth. So this is a really big turnaround, but it really showing you the power of this new class of people now, changing things drastically. It's going to really add up into the 1773 Enclosure Act. This is a public act. A public act essentially affects everybody. Okay, private act, one place or entity. Public act, the law. Okay, so this is the first really significant public act that is saying we're going to enclose. And what it does is it basically streamlines the process that had been sort of activated in the private bills. Okay, and this 1773 Enclosure Act requires that 3/4 of the landowners in a village must petition if they want to have the land enclosed. Okay, now notice that's 3/4 of the landowners, not 3/4 of the people. Okay, so it sort of tells you who gets what they want, right? A notice must be put up, and then that petition goes to a committee in Parliament who assess the proposal to enclose the commons and the lands in that area. And that committee Usually they accept it. The bill then goes to Parliament. So it's sort of the equivalent of a private bill. You're still saying, I'm enclosing this, I'm enclosing that. But the Public Act has made the process very streamlined. So it's really still private bills coming through, but the Public Act has made it very streamlined. Landowners say, we want to enclose, put up the notice, send it to committee, goes bill, boom, done. Okay, there's no weird, look, how do we do this process? Here's the steps. If the bill is passed, then commissioners are recruited. Again, usually the commissioners are fellow landowners and often sort of picked by the landowners. They do a map, and then that gets enclosed. The open fields get engrossed and enclosed, and the commons, they get split up amongst the landowners to enclose as well. So if you've got a woodland here, you can basically, okay, there's 4 landowners, each of you gets 1/4 of the woods, and here's your fences, right? So those tenants, the ones who were the tiny landowners, relied on the commons for so much resources and grazing, they're being squeezed out. From this process, I talked in the previous lecture about how they've been squeezed out by the engrossment of large farms, just putting them out of competition, or they lose their fields in the open fields. Now they're losing the commons. So they don't even have access to that. So it's really getting dispossessed, especially when you engross and enclose the open field system. So it's accelerating that process I talked about in the previous video. But it's a very streamlined process now. Okay, we want to enclose. Send it to Parliament, boom, enclosed. The landowners, as I talked about, in 3/4 of the landowners, this could be one person or a handful of farmers, right? They're the ones who get to say the tenants, right? No say. And they tend to select their own commissioners, like I said before. And even if the tenants want to protest, the notice has been put up, and they're like, oh, we don't want this enclosed. What are they going to do? Go to London? It's kind of hard. It's expensive to get there, and who's going to listen to you when you get there? And if you do protest, you might get repercussions from the landlord, like, oh, you don't like this being enclosed? You're kicked off the land. So it's really, really, the process is just now Parliament saying, go ahead and enclose everything. It is modified in the 1773 Enclosure Act is modified by the 1801 Enclosure Consolidation Act. And this basically sort of, again, is just further tweaking and streamlining. It allowed for areas where you have considerable common lands. It streamlines the process for large-scale enclosure of public lands, of common lands. Like, oh yeah, here's our big, huge area of Lammas lands or big forest. Boom. Okay, here's the process for enclosing that. It did permit rights of way to be preserved. So, people can still have and that's still a thing in England today, that there are rights of way, there are pathways, and you can follow through what is private property and woodlands and so forth. And those pathways are preserved today. I've gone hiking on trails, and you're like, oh, I'm going through this farmer's field, and here's his cows. But it's a right of way. So there's a little bit of protection there. But on the whole, it's basically saying, go ahead and enclose all this vast common land. And then the final step is the 1845 Enclosure Act, which basically gets rid of even the private acts. Okay, remember in 1773, it was a public act. It basically just streamlined the process of each private act that goes through. Here's how you do it. 1845, they just say, let's just not even bother with that. Okay, now you essentially don't need a private act. You don't need a petition. I say there are full-time commissioners who are Parliament has hired, and those commissioners can just go around at the request of landowners and make the maps and enclose the process. It's like final step. okay, let's get some commissioners, go around the country, what needs enclosing, get it done. And the next 20 years, in the 1840s to 1860s, is just whatever's is a really massive, large-scale process of finishing off enclosures. Pretty spectacularly. It's just boom. And you can go to archives and look at this period in the mid-19th century after this act with the full-time commissioners, and look at, here they come to town, and here they look at the commons, and here they say, okay, this field and these woods and that pond can stay common and the rest is enclosed. Done. It's sort of interesting to look at that process. And those little bits that were left, I talked about, here's a field and that, and you can have these. There was a later Commons Act in 1899, and I'm pushing up a bit, which allowed localities to maintain these commons for recreation and parks. So there's no more commons, right, in the old way where the lammas lands where you can graze your animals for half the year, or here's a woodland where you can have rights of pannage and estover, right? And here's some wasteland where you can access resources like, now here's some fields where the people can have some recreation, and woods for walking, okay? So it's not the commons. It is the commons, but it's not the traditional commons. It's like, here's some parks for the people. We'll preserve those bits. So the Enclosure Acts are, a complete 180-degree change of what's going on, from often resisted for over several centuries local efforts at enclosure by the landowners, to the landowners becoming the most powerful people, at least in the House of Commons, and controlling, the economy in the county. And they're just saying, well, we're in power, we're going to do it. And you have the Enclosure Acts, and 6 million acres enclosed over a period of, say, about a century, if that. Impacts, it is more efficient. The land is engrossed and enclosed, and you have less wastage of empty strips and things scattered around. It is efficient. Then the farmers can then do what they want on their land, which allows for experimentation and modernization and so forth. The problem is, right, the eviction of these tenants, of these poor farmers, of these small people. All right, they don't have access to commons. They don't have the land if it's been open field system that's been consolidated, engrossed, and you've got this massive proletariat. So if you talk about what I talked about in the last video about this growth of commercial farming, combine it with these Enclosure Acts, which are really, the two go hand in hand. It's the same century, right? Saying, okay, we've got commercial farming, we want to own the land, and now we're going to enclose it. Okay, the two are hand in hand. We get the modern landscape. And part of that, linked to that, are what's called the Black Acts. Well, specifically the Black Act, and some of the follow-ups. We point out here that we're talking the word black in this sense. It's 18th century. There is not a racial element to this. This is we're talking about, and we'll talk about these poachers who blacken their faces to try and hide their identity. There's not a racial element to this. It's not blackface. And it's not an act to do with, or anything to do with what they would have called black people, right? So we talk about that. This is just an element of people disguising themselves, camouflaging themselves, and acts against people blackening themselves for hiding. So there's not a racial element to this. So when I'm talking about poachers, right? People taking game and products from other people's land, right? And as we're seeing, right, there's more and more land being enclosed, engrossed, fenced off by the 18th century, and there's an increase in poaching. These people are being pushed off the commons. I still want to go get rabbits from this area. I want to hunt some deer, and they're losing the land. And by the 1720s, there's a very active, almost like a resistance movement, only in a couple of areas. But there are these groups of people, men, who are sort of maybe covering themselves up, blackening their faces, anything to sort of hide themselves a little bit, who go to private parks, which is usually belonging to a noble who's got this park, this land that's purely for his recreation and use and hunting, and private forests, again, usually of the nobility and royalty too. And they're going in there in groups, 16, 20, 30 people, and we're going to go in and we're going to hunt some deer and we're going to take them. And you're not going to stop us. And we're going in disguise. Hence the blackening faces. They were called the blacks because they blackened their faces. And these raids are going in. It's a very political statement. It's not just standard poaching, which goes back centuries and continues on. But literally people getting together and saying, we are going to this private property, this park, this forest, and we're going to take animals. And we're going to take what we want. And we're making a statement out of it. It's only a few counties, only a few groups. It's not a massive national movement, but it's enough to aggravate the property owners, the landowners. There's resistance against our having all of this land. Okay, we've got to put it down. We've got to stop it. Okay, so in 1723, Parliament enacts the Black Act of 1723. Okay, it is a massive overreaction, but it is this sense of we need to bring order and discipline. And how many times we use that word in dealing with laborers and workers, craftsmen, right, peasants, right? Discipline and order. There must always be discipline and order. If you don't have it, everything will fall apart, right? So these small groups of people in a couple of counties doing these raids, that's a lack of order. That's a potential for anarchy. What if other people copy them? What if these protests get out of control, right? We're going to lose power. So it is a massive overreaction. It is like we're squashing this right now as brutally as possible so we can maintain order and discipline over the rest. Okay, so this law, anybody who is armed and has blackening on their face, or is armed and disguised, or is helping such people, accessories, right, and is found in a forest or a park, is immediately sentenced to death. Okay, you're in there, you're disguised, you're in blackening, you've got a musket, boom, death sentence. Okay, you may not have even done anything, or you're just trespassing, or you shot a deer. It's a death sentence. Okay, if you hunt or fish or cut down trees in a park or forest, you're subject to transportation to a penal colony, right? At this point, it's probably the Americas or Ireland. Later in the century, though, they'll use Australia. But yeah, transportation, just hunting or fishing in one of these private parks or forests, off to America. Okay, burning of haystacks, wood piles, burning someone's house, right, or barns. Again, these protesters coming in and saying, you've enclosed all this, you've built a barn there, we're burning it down. Okay, it's a crime. But it's a death sentence in the Black Act. In fact, for 50 different criminal acts involving hunting or disguise, poaching or property damage, have the death penalty. 50 criminal acts with the death penalty, all to do with basically poaching or property damage. And so we're putting these down, and a number of these men in these raids are captured and sentenced to death. The problem is, right, enclosure and engrossment has left a lot of people without land, a lot of people without access to commons. They're very angry. Some of these people are protesting, but the government uses the control of the law, right? This is not a democratic government. It is still the property owners, and they are, boom, using the law to enforce their power brutally. Again, right, enclosures, commercialization, the law enforcing protection of their property from the people who've been dispossessed. It's all connected. The Black Act will actually be repealed 100 years later in 1823. Stiff opposition in the House of Lords, right? The House of Lords of the nobility, the House of Commons of these gentry and merchants. But it is part of, they're overruled by the House of Commons. Different story here, but you're beginning to get the 19th century Reform Acts, where there's a beginning of some idea of democratization and a more equal society beginning to emerge in some of these slowly occurring Reform Acts, and it's probably one of the earlier ones. But that's the 19th century. But for the 18th century, we've got the Black Act. We've enclosed. Keep off, or you die. Okay. So that's that.